So this is the 11 Pro Max and this is the iPhone 14 Pro Max. Now the 11 Pro Max has been on the market for 4 years, and I'm leaving these in a case just to show you how thick these phone differences are with the iPhone 14 Pro Max versus the 11 Pro Max. And you can see the curved nature of the 11 Pro Max and the 14 Pro Max. When you place these boys on a table, there is much more of a lift because most cases will integrate a camera, a raised camera to protect the cameras on the already raised up iPhone 14 Pro Max. And so in this episode, I want to talk to you about my 4 years later thoughts with the iPhone 11 Pro Max versus what's current, the iPhone 14 Pro Max, and if you've held out this long, if you should consider, getting this when it comes down or just going to the upcoming 15 Ultra or 15 Pro Max, whatever they're going to call it. So the 11 Pro Max was the last iPhone Max to have the curved edges here, a lot like the iPhone 10. The last one to have a 6.5-inch display. And it was one of the lighter iPhone Maxes, in the past few years. The XS Max was even lighter. But this is not quite as light as the 14 Plus. But it really was the iPhone that introduced the textured back. It was basically a really big leap with the triple cameras, and they just gotten bigger and bigger. And it's funny to think how tiny those look now comparatively to the lenses on the 14 Pro Max. At the time, these things were really quite big. This does have an Apple A13 Bionic chipset, which is several years older, and only 4 gigs of RAM, which is often found on the regular edition iPhones. It still has the latest OS updates to iOS 16.6, and again with the triple 12 megapixel camera on the rear. It did introduce the ultra wide, but also brought a telephoto as well. But this telephoto doesn't zoom quite as far as the current models. It can only do 2x and up to 10 times zoom, which is not quite the 15 you can do on the iPhone 13 Pro Max or the iPhone 14 Pro Max. Alright, so the build quality between both of these. How much better has it gotten over the years, of using these two products, and 4 years later? Has it really been that much better? And the answer is not really. So the 11 Pro Max, even to this day, feels just about as premium, in my opinion, as the iPhone 14 Pro Max when it comes to the stainless steel edges. The back texture is pretty much the same, even though the cameras are much larger on the 14 Pro Max. The back texture is about the same. The weight does give you a little bit more of a substantial feel for the iPhone 14 Pro Max, but the phone itself didn't feel too much more premium. Just a little bit, more squared. Well, a little bit more squared here. It's still curved a little bit at the edges, but you know what I'm saying. This is more of a curved kind of size here. It just felt a little more comfortable in the hand, in my personal take. But overall, the weight definitely gives the iPhone 14 Pro Max a little bit more of density, so it can feel a little more premium in that sense. But overall, these phones, over the 4 years, I would say Apple's been employing essentially the same type of material since the 11 Pro Max. And so the 11 Pro Max has held on very well, going into its 4th year here just in September. And would you want to upgrade in terms of the build? I would say if they go to a titanium model, yes. If you're going to the 14 Pro Max, it's going to be more of a size jump versus such a better build. You'll definitely feel the difference in design because of the industrial square edges, but you won't feel too much more in the term of premium. So the iPhone 11 Pro Max, if you look closely, does have definitely a bigger notch. And we do have a dynamic island for the 14 Pro Max, and that really does set it apart and making it look like a much newer phone or the latest phone that came out. But honestly, I think the Galaxy S10 Plus had this type of cutout. So I think even if they put that back in 2019, it still would have looked up to date back then. So I do really think Apple is behind when it comes to the design of the display. Now, if they do go ahead and bring the bezels a little bit closer to the edge, a full screen, which we're expecting for the 15 Pro Max, that's going to be a very different look because most Android phones have bigger bezels. So I think Apple's going to step it up with that. But we're probably going to see Dynamic Island on all of the upcoming iPhones. And while it's not a bad thing, all I'm saying here is that if you come from the notch over here to the Dynamic Island, it will feel newer, but the novelty of that wears off kind of fast, and it's not really it's not like going to an all-screen phone or something like that. It's just going to a smaller notch, essentially, that has some feature set to it. And those features are pretty cool. I'm not going to kid with you. I definitely would say that if you're looking for a phone with something a little bit more unique and different, this definitely is unique. Now, you can see when you enable a timer or you do start using the dynamic island, it definitely spreads out to be about the same size as notch. But at least they're integrating something in there while we wait till we get to the point where we can have an all-screen iPhone. So several months later, when it comes to, did I say several months? Several years later when it comes to Face ID, we still have the raise to wake on the iPhone 11 Pro Max, and Face ID works wonderfully well. It's just as secure, and it's been a great experience for the iPhone 11 Pro Max. Now, on the 14 Pro Max, I do find it to be snappier. I think it's just a little bit better, quicker, and also just better on different angles. So this is kind of an upgrade in terms of the reliability, the speed, the angles at which it can see you. I do think the Face ID experience has become better all the way up until now. So while you still have it on the iPhone 11 Pro Max, it still works wonderfully well. I do think you have a snappier Face ID experience for the iPhone 14 Pro Max. Now, 4 years later, when it comes to the actual display, the biggest upgrade comes in the way of size. You get a 0.2-inch larger screen. I think next year we might see a 6.9-inch iPhone. Maybe not this year. We'll see what happens, but definitely get a larger screen, but that comes with a weight penalty. We'll see if the 15 Ultra or Pro Max brings that weight down with titanium build. But over here, you get a lot more brightness. So way more brightness. At the time, the 11 Pro Max was one of the brightest phones out there, though. So it's like around 1,000 nits, something like that, 800. It's probably like 800, but it's pretty darn bright as well. So I don't really see it being an issue even now using an 11 Pro Max. Although the 14 Pro Max brightness did increase substantially. And 4 years later, I do think they've refined and polished the display up. It's definitely bigger, a little bit more accurate. Definitely a little bit, it's definitely way smoother than the iPhone 11 Pro Max with its 60 hertz. But surprisingly, I can still get by using 11 Pro Max with no issues. I'm just saying. The 14 Pro Max is a much more polished experience due to the 120 hertz ProMotion display. So other than that, I would say that you have, with the pill, you have a little bit closer to a full screen, but it's still in the way. But, you know, overall, it's a decent upgrade. I wouldn't say it's massive. So when it comes to the software, this is the great thing about using an iOS product is that, you know, I remember buying this phone brand new 4 years ago, and I knew when I was picking this up at the Apple stores that I'm going to have great software support on this phone for several years to come. And that's exactly what happened. I'm still running the latest and greatest iOS 16.6 with the upcoming 17 version just next month. So it's just really been fantastic to see that I can run the same things I can run on my 14 Pro Max on my 11 Pro Max. And they don't really struggle too much. The only thing that struggles a little bit on the iPhone 11 Pro Max is the speed when you're doing heavy games and stuff like that. You know, some things can, you know, make this phone warm up a little bit. It can throttle a little bit if you're playing heavy for a long time. Other than that, I don't really find it to be too much of an issue, but you can definitely see the performance gains with the iPhone 14 Pro Max with the A16 Bionic chip. It's just much snappier to go through things and load things. I would say in some cases, these phones these days are getting too fast. Like, they're so fast, you can't even think before they're loading stuff up. So they're incredibly quick now. Like, the fastest you would ever expect. They're getting to that point, and they're going to go even faster on the Apple iPhone 15 Pro Max or 15 Ultra, whatever it's going to be called. They're going to go even quicker. So if you do want a nice performance jump, though, and you've had your 11 Pro Max, I would say at this point you might want to consider going to one of the upcoming phones or the iPhone 14 Pro or Pro Max. Okay, so 4 years later, as long as your battery health maximum capacity is up there still, the iPhone 11 Pro Max easily makes it a full day still. With the iPhone 14 Pro Max, in some cases, if I have the brightness jacked up, it would actually drain faster than my 11 Pro Max. The 11 Pro Max was one of the best battery life iPhones ever made. And then they had the 12 Pro Max, which was a year, and then we had the 13 Pro Max, which upped the 11 Pro Max. So yeah, my battery capacity is still high on the 11 Pro Max because it hasn't been my main phone in a long time. But, 4 years later, since I still have a high maximum capacity, I can definitely still make it through a full day easily on that phone. As a matter of fact, it looks like it's draining a little slower in this video than the 14 Pro Max, but both of them can make it through a day, no problem. And now with the newer updates, they have the clean energy charging, should make it last longer. Battery life is just not an issue with these phones. For some people, the 14 Pro Max it is, but 11 Pro Max, even on the latest software, is doing okay. So the cameras, how do they stack up now on the iPhone 11 Pro Max versus the iPhone 14 Pro Max? You can see they're much larger on the 14 Pro Max, but if I go ahead and actually fire off a photo, what does it look like? So let me go ahead and take this shot on the 11 Pro Max. We have very good video still, 4K 60. I'll tell you, the 11 Pro Max was the phone that started it off for me with wanting to really use iPhones as my main camera, as a usage, or as even a B tool. I still use, an actual camera for video because I find the customization of the settings on a real camera is just easier to use. It's just better laid out. It's more focused in the sense that I don't get distracted by apps when I'm trying to make a video. But at the same time, the 11 Pro Max brought the 4K 60 on the rear, and the front it matched up. It was really my favorite my first time I was really like, okay, these phones are ready to go. They're ready to rock in the studio and make videos and do that thing. And this phone still does it to this day. However, I will say that there's a level of noise in here that you can see, especially in lower light, and where you don't see it in the iPhone 14 Pro Max. The 14 Pro Max has just much more sharp images, just better.